Hello, welcome to InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw. Today we ask, what made a farmer, father of 10, pull up stakes in 1843 and emigrate with his family to Oregon country and settle along the Willamette River? Who had already settled here before the American settlers? And how did this man, who owned land known by his community as Keizer Bottom, become the namesake for what became the city of Keizer? For answers, my guest, volunteer historian Tammy Wild, spent a year taking a deep dive into Keizer history, which was hard enough to track down, and turned it into a virtual exhibit, a Willamette Farmer's Legacy, Thomas Dove Keizur. She won a grant through the Oregon State Capitol Foundation, which is hosting this online exhibit through September, but it will be getting a more permanent home at Keizer's Historic Museum. Well, who was Thomas Keizer? His story takes us back in time before Oregon was even a territory, and others, including the British and French, wanted to stake their own claim to it, even going to war over it. Hello, Tammy.
Hello.
Hold on to your hats. This is going to be a wild ride, and along with us here is Thomas Keizer, my new best friend here.
Yeah, he's part of the interview here. He's as big as life almost here.
And just because I have to ask, what is this here?
That is the election ballot from 1844, where it actually has the vote count. So you can see Thomas Dove was the third highest count after Daniel Waldo and Robert Newell. They were the top runners for the seats there. There were 8 men that were selected that year.
And some of those names went on to make history themselves.
Yes, it's been kind of a fascinating connection there to see. P.H. Burnett was the first governor of California. He had moved on to California after his time in Oregon.
And there's a name Waldo.
Yes, which we have Waldo Middle School here in Salem that's named after the Waldo family. And David Hill, who founded Hillsboro.
Oh, for heaven's sakes.
And then Robert Newell up at the Shampooey Park. There's the Newell Museum. Many kids have gone on field trips there, and I participated in field trips there, and beautiful historic home that's been preserved where Robert Newell lived.
You are a volunteer historian for the Keizer Historic Museum. How did you get going on this project?
Well, I don't know, my curiosity for history started with my father, who grew up with his grandparents on a farm in Missouri, and the stories that he would tell of his chores on the farm and milking the cows and not having electricity and different things just intrigued me, that people live like that. And I was always just curious and wanted to know more. And in high school, I did a paper on my dad, kind of my first historic writing, and then went on a search for the family tree and genealogy. And so I learned some research skills doing that and knowing where to look. And back then you had to go look at microfilms and go to family history locations and search, or at the state library or different places.
That's right.
It was before the internet.
Before the internet, right. And making it easy to go cross country to get information. You had to do it writing letters and everything else, right?
And the city library, which Salem Library, has been wonderful to preserve history too. They're a good source here in town as well. So I got started with that, and then in our Keizer Times newspaper, Ann Lossner used to write articles on historic people and places in Keizer, and that kind of piqued my interest in Keizer. We lived near the old Evans Farm home, which is now the restaurant Mommy and Maddie's, and so I'd seen that home being derelict and just kind of decaying over the years back in the 80s and early 90s. But I went to the museum to purchase Ann's book, and then talked to a wonderful woman that was in her 90s, Evelyn Milson Franz, who just kind of sweet talked me into joining the museum committee. And then before I knew it, I was involved in a book project, and they needed somebody that had some computer skills and some digital photo skills to produce that. And
so that was your first book?
Yeah.
This is wonderful. It's called Images of America, Keizer.
Yes, so that came out in 2015, and the book is dedicated to Ann Losner, and I was able to attend her 100th birthday party, and then just right after her 101st birthday, she passed, but we were able to present her a copy of the book, and her son said that she was waiting for the book to come out. It was just really sweet, and I loved that I was able to use her resources that she had gathered in the 70s and the 80s.
That's so interesting. People have old pictures and people find them once they've passed. Sometimes a family can say, who was that person? Who was that person? And there you have it. Pictures do tell their own story.
Yes. And I love the Arcadia style is mainly photos with, the captions under it, so the photos are intriguing.
How did you get involved doing a Willamette Farmer's Legacy?
So I saw on Facebook the Oregon State Capitol had a little blurb about having a grant for some related to government involvement, and I thought, well, our town's Thomas Dove Keizur, he was involved in government. It's like maybe he would qualify, and we could share the publicity about him to make him known to more people outside of the city of Keizer.
He really was civically involved. What did he do? Just for example, he was. What were the positions he held?
Yeah, he was in the 1844 pre-provisional legislature, which the ballot is shown there. In fact, for Oregon, it was historic. It was the very first election. The previous government was just by selection, but this one, they actually were voted. As time went on and there were more people coming out here, they actually had a real election, and so he was voted in. So that's special that here we are in an election year, and to think back, to be part of Oregon's first election was quite a unique thing. And
I don't think people really understand how we got to be Oregon the state. I've talked about in the introduction Oregon country, and I had to ask myself when I first learned that, Oregon country, Oregon country. Wait a minute, that's before Oregon territory? What was going on when we were Oregon country?
Yeah, other than the natives that lived here, this was kind of no man's land. It didn't belong to anyone, even though it was occupied with French trappers that came, and the British fur trading companies. They kind of had a monopoly here, and then we're trying to get this land for their territory, and of course the United States wanted it for their territory. So, and then a lot of the everyday function of the people here was run by the Hudson Bay Company. So it was even more just the fur traders had such a monopoly. And we have French Prairie, which was settled by French Canadian fur trappers, and then the first Americans coming were the mission people, and settling just north of Keizer is the Methodist Mission, which is now Willamette Mission State Park.
The War of 1812 decided it once and for all, and that really wasn't won by either side much, was it?
Yeah, it even in Keizer's day, it still was kind of a quasi land. It wasn't truly settled, but that's what they were trying to do, because 1846 was the Oregon Treaty. That's where they established the 49th parallel, kind of up, giving us the border. But before that, the border between Canada and Washington. We
had our own big plans then. We had a huge territory that we were looking at. What did that encompass?
And as we noticed yesterday was the anniversary for the Oregon Territory. It was in August 14th. Seeing that it was Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and part of Wyoming. So this isn't just an Oregon story. It really is the whole Pacific Northwest. And that Oregon was the capital. Oregon City was the capital. So a lot of it was centered in Oregon, you know, to start with as it branched out. And
so I'm picturing Thomas Keizer and his family and all the people who arrived with him coming into a situation that was really still kind of an unknown, what belonged to whom, and there was a contest of wills over it. So the land that he chose to settle on, was that a donation land? How did he get that land? Did he know he was going to be getting it?
From what I understand, it's it was just a free-for-all. You just kind of pick where nobody's at that time, because it was before, well, the government, of course, was encouraging settlers to come out here to establish it for the United States. But I think that, you know, they just picked an unoccupied area, which by the river with the floods that happen periodically, no one had claimed that area in Keizer, which is a little lower lying level, but the soil is very fertile there, so it made good farmland. But I think they were spared as much as we know from the flooding.
He was a skilled farmer. Years later, somebody, Jerry McGee, who played the role of Thomas Keizer, had said if he hadn't have been so good at picking out good fertile farmland in those floods, there would be no Keizer. Is there truth to that?
Yes, and then coming with a family of 10 children, and the wives had married, and some grandchildren that came too. So they got the whole little strip all along that make up today's Keizer into North Salem. So even, you know, part of the land was all the way into what is now Salem as well, in North Salem.
Before we get too far into his history once landed here, can you give us a sense of who Thomas Keizer was? Where was he born?
Yeah, he was born in North Carolina. He and his wife, Mary Gurley, both born on the same day, November 19th or 20th. There's different records, but everyone says it's the same day. And double check in 1798. I don't have that one written down, but they were born in North Carolina and married in 1813, which is kind of interesting. It's the same time that the fur trapping post Wallace House closed that year. So it's kind of interesting how a little tie along from North Carolina, way over in North Carolina, but what would be his future land, there was a fur trapping post there called Wallace House. But that was the same year they were married. And then in pursuit for better land and with dreams of having a stud farm, raising horses, he was looking for better land. They moved to Tennessee, and reports say by then more settlers were moving westward, and the good land was already taken up. So then they moved on to Arkansas and stayed there a couple of years. But then as things built to keep going west, then they moved to Missouri, and they were hoping to get in the 1842 wagon train going, but they missed the cutoff for that, and so they had a whole year to prepare, which was actually a good thing. It made them more prepared and ready and set for the long journey across on what would become the Oregon Trail.
Did you learn anything about his horses? You said something about horses.
Well, it's kind of a famous thing. Our statue in Keizer, that's right at Keizer City Hall. It's the statue of Thomas Dove Keizur mounted on his Morgan horse. So specifically the Morgan breed, they were the first ones to bring the Morgan horses here to Oregon. So that's his little claim to fame. And then apple trees.
Apple trees.
So he was one of the first to bring apple trees over this way. So
what was life like along the Oregon Trail for these settlers going west? Did you learn anything about his journey here?
I know you had mentioned Jerry McGee had written a non-fiction fictional book about the Keizer's journey, and it's a fun read. It's out of publication, but you can find some used books online too. It's A Long Way to Oregon.
Let's see it.
Yes, we have it on the coffee table.
Let's just see. It's A Long Way to Oregon, the westward saga of the Keizer family.
And so he does some, personal narrative added in there, but just thinking of other diaries and books we've read and movies in our age, what we've seen. That riding along in a wagon wasn't comfortable. It was usually more comfortable to walk or ride a horse, but they also had cows they brought with them and oxen. So it was a tough journey, and stopping and fixing food and having your provisions and keeping your weight down, all the preparations and forging across rivers and stuff. It's kind of amazing the details that are put in there, and think, how many people would know how to do all those things and the right kind of wood to use that floats the best and different things. There's just a lot that really went into preparing.
And once he was here, did he make any connections outside his own community group?
Well, the wagon train coming in 1843 was the biggest one, and there's different estimates from 500 to 700 people, counting all the children. So it was a really big group that broke off in different sections. So a lot of them, they made longtime friends. And also preparing in Missouri. There was others. I know the Nesmiths were also in Missouri at the time. Some of them they met, in preparation and then on the trail too. So it is kind of interesting when I looked at a lot of these men and double checked when they came, them and then others that served in the executive committee and the judicial part of the government as well. Most of them were in 1843 or pre, or were already here. So, it was a tight-knit group. They traveled together, and then they settled, often in the same area. And, and the population was so low.
As you got digging from their arrival here to settling in, what more did you learn? Where did you take the story from there?
Well, part of getting this grant, just trying to get more visuals, because we had the portrait of Thomas Dove, and that's the only picture that we have of him. So trying to find what other visual things to tell the story. We have his obituary that was in the paper. We included a picture of Oregon City, because that is where they met for the provisional government, as that was the capital of the Oregon country at that time. And then the ballot there, which also, it was more, I love our graphic design artist, Andrew Jackson with Ann Branding. He took my information and he just ran with it and made it happen beyond my expectations. And
it is a beautiful graphic.
Yeah, so that was one thing. He had the idea of cropping the ballot and just using that. That's the top portion. It had the other committees on there, but this is just the legislative committee where Thomas Dove served. But it was just fun to see that and pour through old newspapers, which the University of Oregon has a wonderful free resource for anybody to search keywords, which the Keizer family, it's hard to search the name because the name spelling, there's at least 15 different ways they spelled it. And some of the accounts, like they would have Thomas Dove and then have his son John Brooks, and they would have different spellings, just from one line to the next line. There's no rhyme or reason to it. So it does make it a little more challenging searching his name. And sometimes it's TD, sometimes it's Thomas, sometimes it's Thomas Dove. So yeah, he's kind of a hard man to search for in some respects.
You did get to look at a lot of old pictures. Was there anything there that was useful for the exhibit?
Not many pictures. You know, like the Oregon City, it's a painting. There's no images of the Oregon Rangers per se, or the legislature.
Tell me about the Oregon Rangers.
So
what was that?
So just before the election in May, Thomas Dove, so he was involved. We don't have documentation necessarily that he was involved in any governmental meetings, but in March he was already selected as the captain of the Oregon Rangers. So he was involved in some of the talks and the different meetings and stuff to be selected as the captain. And he did prove himself on the Oregon Trail. He and his sons were leaders in forging different trails and taking off some different groups the way they were traveling and leading those. So his leadership qualities were evident on the Oregon Trail.
We're talking about the Oregon Rangers. That sounds like people on horseback. What was the Oregon Rangers?
It was the first militia group for the territory, and also it was a presence, like you said, with the competition between the British and stuff. So if they could establish a militia to already have a presence here, just kind of gave a little more fortitude for the Americans being here. And the British were sending in ships too, frigates off the coast that were going into Washington, down to Nisqually area of Washington. And so they were kind of bringing in a little more of a presence. And so the Americans were doing what they could with the resources they had. And so the militia was one thing that they established. What I'm reading, though, for the most part, it was pretty peaceable. You know, you had the missionaries, you had the Catholic missionaries and the Protestant missionaries coming in, fur traders that maybe the fur trading had stopped, but they settled in the area, and many of them, especially the French Canadians, married Indian wives too and settled in the area. And so, you know, a community was being established by this little hodgepodge of settlers that settled here.
That's interesting. Not only that, but the role that the Oregon Rangers played in kind of keeping the peace as a first militia.
Yes, and honestly, there wasn't a whole lot that happened with it. I think it was a lot in name only, but just to gather names and everything showed the U.S. government that they were working to organize themselves and establish themselves, you know, on behalf of the United States government to be an entity available if needed. So they did that. One thing that I found in the Oregon Rangers that I was really fascinated with, and I first saw it in a newspaper clipping about the 1846 4th of July celebration. They had one, before that they had just done a celebration in Oregon City, but this is when the Methodist mission had moved more to Salem proper from you know, farther north along the river, and the community of Salem was growing and had actually officially named it Salem. And it was also the time the treaty had happened. You have to look. It was the Oregon Treaty, so it was before the Oregon Territory, so it's still quasi land, but there was a ruling to establish that for America, and they flew the flag for the first time in Salem, and they chose the Oregon Rangers to display the flag. And it was a handmade flag, and there's records of the women that made it, and so they had to hand sew the flag, which if on our website you can go through the timeline and you can go through all these things and come across, there's a picture of the flag and the stars that were there. I think the 32, because we're the 33rd, so I think the 32 stars at that time. but that was really fascinating to hear. It's something special and something good that the Oregon Rangers were involved with, something peaceable and just a community thing that they paraded them through Salem with that.
When did Thomas Keizer die?
He died June 19th of 1871 on his property in Keizer, and we have from family stories that he is buried on the property, and we assume his wife Mary, who had died 18 years earlier, also was buried there. And the family legend has it that they were buried on the cliff looking over the river. And so whether the body is still there, the bones there, or have they been washed out from a flood years ago? So that's kind of an interesting little thing about Keizer, that their relics, their bones could still be there along the banks of the Willamette River where they settled, and not too far from where the Wallace House, the fur trading post, was, which we have a park called Wallace House Park that commemorates that portion of history of Keizer too. But the obituary that was in the paper, I like the quote that kind of summed up his life, that noted, as a citizen he was much respected, in every way worthy. Those of us who for many years past have been used to seeing his venerable form on our streets occasionally, and to receive his warm and kindly greeting, will miss him in the future, but there will always be left the pleasant remembrance of the old friend and neighbor. I thought that was a nice way to kind of sum up his life. And also our exhibit, we put a Willamette farmer's legacy, because there's also a statement where that was really all he really wanted to be, was just a farmer and living his life, and raising the family and being a good father. But also he wanted to be active in his community and make his community better. I know there was found some comments about roads was a big thing, and his property was along River Road, and the River Road today, it's the same. So obviously he dealt with roads and expanding roads. I mean, we all know as time goes on how roads widen and they take over people's properties and different things. So roadway was one of his things that he was interested in, and it was one of the things that they voted on in the 1844 legislature. There was quite a few issues of schools and roads and different public service things, just making and building the community, all the infrastructure that comes with building a community.
Fast forward to more current times, all of that area remained farmland until roughly the early 50s. Am I right?
Right. After the baby boom time after the war, Keizer got his first subdivision, because it had always been farmland in the area, and because of the flooding that people didn't really want to build there, but it also was very good for farmland. And a few little streets and neighborhoods popped up, but the first subdivision, Mambrin Gardens, is still there today, and that was one of the first subdivisions. And then that's really the influx, and then the business community, the Keizer's time started. The Commercial Business Club was the first organization to try to build up Keizer. The Keizer News is what was put out by the business club.
And then when it became big enough to be called a city, when was that?
Well, it was always the community of Keizer, because even when I went to school in the 70s, it was Keizer, but our mailing address was Salem. It was kind of this quasi thing. We lived in Keizer, but our address was Salem. But it wasn't until 1982 that at the election, it was voted to become a city. They had tried several other times to annex it and be incorporated into its own city, and those efforts had failed. But in 1982, they were successful, and so we are a young city, but we have been called Keizer since the Keizer School was established in 1878, is about when when it was referred to as Keizer. So that was, what, 7 years after Keizer had died that it started becoming called Keizer. We don't have record of it being called Keizer before that. Before that, it was called Wallace Prairie, or north of Salem, or even Chemawa. The census records, and even Fairfield, some of the farther north ones have Fairfield for that area. So even on census records, they weren't sure, or North Marion County.
I love the fact that the Keizer citizens decided we have to have a monument to this guy. Tell us about the monument that was unveiled in 2010.
Yes. Yeah, 2010, we got our very own statue, and there was a committee formed. Former council member Jerry McGee was one of the heads. He's like the Keizer cheerleader. He did a lot to bring Keizer to the forefront and helped get a monument. We have right on River Road and Chemawa Road a plaque that talks about the donation land claim, that was the line for their property. And it goes all the way to Keizer Rapids Park. A lot of people don't know that was the son John Brooks' donation land claim all the way back that side of the river. And then Cummings Elementary, that property was where Thomas Dove and Mary had their property all along down the river. But back to the statue.
Oh, it's magnificent.
Yeah, it's large.
Who made it?
And Gareth Curtis was the sculpturist, larger than life, sitting on the podium up there, mounted on his Morgan horse, with a rifle on the one side. You can see the rifle on the other side, and so it's quite unique. In fact, searching for Keizer years ago, I found the statue on a Morgan horse website that it's noted for the Morgan horse. And so that was kind of neat that we made a notation for that historic tidbit on it. But he's larger in life right there at Keizer City Hall for everybody to see. Drive by along Chemawa and see him 24/7.
He really did seem to impart some of his spirit and ideas to what became Keizer.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you've said, he had his imprint.
Yeah, pride, volunteerism are all qualities that Thomas Dove valued and imparted in his family, and him and his sons were part of the Oregon Rangers too, and later his grandson Tillman Ford was also a legislator and a lawyer in the city of Salem. So he had a grandson that also followed in his footsteps to become a state legislator.
I'm still thinking about the fact that you spent a year developing all of this, and I wanted to know, are you thinking that this is something that other people could do? Is there special training to it? Did you have to get a degree in it? I mean, do you encourage people to try this for themselves? Because as I'm thinking, family history is world history.
Exactly. Every family has a story to tell. This just happens to be our city's founding family to tell his story, but each of us has our own story to tell. And I know I've researched my own family, and you don't need any special skills, especially nowadays with the internet. It's quite easy to get on and search keywords, especially if you have an unusual name. If you have a common name, it's more challenging. And then the way they've digitized old newspaper records, and just more and more records have become available, to search and find. So, yeah, I encourage anyone to get involved with their own family or get involved in a local museum.
Yes, Yes, what can they find at the Keizer Historic Museum?
Yeah, we do have these miniature versions of our larger display that will be even bigger than these panels behind us. We're going to have displayed in November at Keizer City Hall, November 15th.
Oh.
We'll have a big celebration because November's a big month for the Keizers. They arrived in Oregon in 1843 in Keizer in November. They were married in November, and Thomas Dove and his wife Mary were born in November too. So it's like a big month for the Keizers. So we're going to celebrate this November, and because we have this new exhibit that we received such a generous grant to be able to develop more visuals, because there wasn't a lot that we had. We've got a few family items that are on display at the museum. So we have some different things at the museum, but then we have 4 different panels, and they're also represented in the website too, the interactive part of the website, but a little different version. So you can experience different things at the Keizer Heritage Museum on the website, and then when we do the larger displays, it'll be presented in a little different format, so different things might pop out at you at one site than another.
So where can they follow you online?
Yeah, we're at KeizerHeritageMuseum.org, and on Facebook, Keizer History. So we've got those 2 internet locations, and then the Keizer Heritage Museum is housed in the Keizer Cultural Center, which is the 1916 Keizer School building that used to be at the corner of River Road and Chemawa, and was moved down the road, and right next to Keizer City Hall is our beautiful building that also houses the Keizer Art Association, the Community Library, and the Keizer Homegrown Theater. So we have 4 tenants in the building, and we're one of them.
So people can actually follow you by your Facebook page for latest developments on things too.
Yeah, Keizer History is the main one, and then also the Cultural Center has a Facebook page too that has some other additional items too posted on there.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey through history, Keizer's history. What I love about this whole thing is that it can't help but spark interest in where Keizer residents live and how they're embraced by not only Keizer's history, Willamette Valley history, but Oregon history, and by extension, American history, because it was all involved in how it formed up and got settled.
Yes.
Thank you, Tammy.
Oh, thank you for having me and inviting me. This has been nice.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank you for joining us today on InSight. I'm Wendy Brokaw.